Dr. Elena Voss had always trusted numbers more than she trusted people, and more than she trusted the stories people told to make numbers feel smaller than they were. Numbers did not flatter you. They did not soften bad news to protect a quarterly earnings call. A number either held, or it did not, and Elena had built her entire career on the quiet, stubborn belief that the truth would always be found in the decimal places, not in the boardroom. It was a Tuesday morning in Everett, Washington, 6 weeks before the busiest travel season of the year, when she found the crack. She was reviewing routine inspection data from Halcyon Aerospace's fleet of narrow-body jets, the kind that flew the same short, tired routes a dozen times a day. Non-destructive testing scans, mostly clean, mostly boring. Then a pattern surfaced in the turbine blade roots. Hairline fractures, small enough to hide from the naked eye, but consistent across enough units that Elena's pulse ticked up before her mind had finished the thought. She pulled the fatigue models. She recalculated the stress concentration factor at the blade root, the exact point where metal, worn down by 1,000 tiny cycles of heat and force, finally begins to remember every single one of them. The number that came back did not match the number in the original design file. Somewhere in the 2 years since the engine retrofit, the loading profile had shifted, and nobody had gone back to check whether the blades could still keep their promise. Elena sat very still for a moment, palms flat on her desk, the fluorescent light humming overhead. Her jaw tightened. This was not fear exactly. It was the particular, focused stillness of an engineer who has just understood something the rest of the building does not yet know. She brought the data to Grace Okafor first, because Grace had trained her, and because Grace still believed, in her better moments, that good engineering could survive a bad quarter. Grace read the printout twice. She exhaled slowly through her nose, the sound of someone doing arithmetic she did not want to do. The math is clean, Elena. I won't pretend otherwise. She rubbed the bridge of her nose. But you know how this building works. Nobody moves for a hairline crack and a theory. They move for something they can't argue with. Then I'll write something they can't argue with. Grace almost smiled, tired and fond at once. Write it careful. Write it precise. And take it to Marcus yourself. Elena spent the next 3 days building a memo the way she built everything, from the ground up, load path by load path. She kept her language plain and her recommendation modest. Not a grounding. Not yet. Just a precautionary inspection on the highest cycle aircraft in the fleet, the ones that had logged the most takeoffs and landings since the retrofit. It was, she told herself, the smallest possible ask. Nobody could call it alarmist. She walked it to Marcus Webb's office herself and set it on his desk with both hands, the way you set down something fragile. Marcus Webb had a way of listening that felt, at first, like respect. He nodded along as Elena walked him through the numbers, chin resting on his knuckles, eyes tracking the chart she'd built. It was only afterward, in the small silences between her sentences, that she noticed he never once picked up a pen. I hear you, he said, when she finished. I do. But look at the sample size here, Elena. A handful of units out of the whole fleet. That's not an emergency. That's a monitoring item. A monitoring item is what you call something after you decide not to act on it. He smiled, not unkindly, the smile of a man who had absorbed 100 versions of this conversation and always won. We're 6 weeks from our busiest season. If I ground aircraft on a preliminary finding, I'm not just costing the company money. I'm handing our competitors the headline. Tighten the language. Take out the word critical. Frame it as an item for continued observation, and I promise you it gets logged, tracked, reviewed next quarter. Elena felt the words rise in her throat and made herself hold them. Her hands, folded in her lap, curled slightly at the knuckles. She had learned over the years that anger looked bad on an engineer. It made people stop hearing the math and start watching her face instead. I won't soften a safety finding to make a launch date more comfortable, she said, evenly. Something in Marcus's expression closed, like a door settling into its frame. Then it stays under review, he said. That's my call, not yours. She left his office with her memo, still technically alive and technically dead. Filed. Archived. Under review. Words that meant, in Halcyon's particular grammar, forgotten on purpose. In the weeks that followed, Elena noticed the small architecture of exclusion. Meetings that used to include her stopped including her. A colleague who once ate lunch across from her every Thursday began finding reasons to eat at his desk. Nobody said anything unkind. Nobody had to. She recognized the pattern for what it was, the quiet, bureaucratic version of being told to sit down. She went home those nights and reread her own memo at the kitchen table, searching for a flaw in her own reasoning, almost hoping to find one. She never did. The number held. It was the only thing in the building that still did. More than once, late at night, she caught herself rehearsing a version of the conversation where she simply let it go. Softened the language the way Marcus had asked. Let monitoring item replace critical finding, and went back to being someone whose calendar was full of meetings again. The thought never lasted longer than a few seconds. It curdled every time, because underneath it was a picture she could not unsee. 200 passengers boarding a jet on the strength of a sentence she knew to be false. She would set the pencil down, press the heels of her hands against her eyes, and start the calculation over from the beginning, as if repetition alone could make the world listen. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not the one Elena had planned. She had gone to Marcus's office to ask a simple procedural question, whether the flagged aircraft had at least been added to the enhanced monitoring schedule he'd promised her weeks earlier. She found instead that they had not. Not one. The schedule Marcus had described in that first meeting, the one that was supposed to make her modest request feel honored rather than buried, did not exist anywhere in the maintenance system. It had been a sentence, not a plan. Something in Elena broke loose that afternoon, some tether she had been holding taut for a month. You told me this would be tracked, she said, and for once her voice did not stay level. It rose, sharp enough that a passing admin glanced through the glass wall and quickly looked away. You stood in this office and told me it would be logged and reviewed, and there is nothing. No inspection order. No flag in the system. Nothing, Marcus. You didn't manage the risk. You managed me. Marcus rose from his chair, color climbing up his neck. Watch your tone. I'll watch my tone when you start watching an airplane. Elena stepped closer to the desk, both hands flat on its surface, the same gesture she used when she wanted a number to hold still under scrutiny. 6 aircraft, Marcus. 6 aircraft carrying that fracture pattern are flying revenue routes right now, today, while you protect a launch date. If one of them comes down, it will not be a monitoring item. It will be a memorial. That's enough. His voice cracked hard across the room, loud enough that the admin at the glass wall this time did not pretend not to hear. You are one engineer with one theory and a talent for making everyone around you feel like a criminal. I have a fleet to run and a company to protect, and I am done being lectured in my own office. Then ground the aircraft, and I'll stop lecturing you. They stood like that for a long moment, close enough that Elena could see the muscle working in his jaw, the particular fury of a man who is used to winning arguments by outlasting them and has just discovered that this one will not end that way. Neither of them looked away first. It was Marcus who finally sat back down, exhaling through his nose, and told her, very quietly, that the meeting was over. Word of the shouting reached the engineering floor before Elena had even made it back to her own desk. The days after the confrontation were worse than anything that had come before it, because now there was a story attached to her name, and stories, Elena was learning, traveled faster than data ever did. She was not called difficult to her face. She did not need to be. She could read it in the way conversations stopped half a beat too late when she walked into the break room, in the careful, over-polite distance people kept, as though volatility might be contagious. She stopped sleeping well. She noticed it first as a tightness behind her eyes that no longer eased by evening, then as a dull, constant ache along her jaw from clenching it in her sleep. She caught herself standing in the grocery store one night, staring at a shelf of coffee she did not need, unable to remember what she had actually come in for. Her appetite thinned. Her hands, usually so steady over a keyboard, developed a small tremor when she was tired, one she hid by folding them in her lap the way she had in Marcus's office, a month of practice now serving a different purpose. Grace found her in the lab past 9 one night, hunched over the same spreadsheet she had already checked a dozen times that week, and gently closed the laptop lid under her hands. "Go home, Elena. The number isn't going to change tonight. I keep thinking if I check it one more time, someone will finally have to listen. They don't need to check it again. They need to be made to look at it." Grace studied her for a moment, the particular, searching look of someone measuring how much weight a colleague is actually carrying. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." "I haven't." Elena said it flatly, the way she reported any other fact, though her hands, still folded, tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap. What Elena did not know, not yet, was that Marcus had already written his own account of the confrontation, 3 typed pages addressed to Richard Hale, framed with the careful, wounded reasonableness of a man defending himself rather than a decision. The memo described a valued engineer whose judgment had, in his words, become compromised by personal fixation. It cited the raised voices in his office, though not what had been said. It suggested, delicately, that Dr. Voss had grown insubordinate, difficult to manage, prone to alarmism that unsettled colleagues and disrupted operational focus during a critical season. It recommended, gently but unmistakably, that her role be reviewed. Richard read it twice at his desk that weekend, the way a careful man reads anything that might later require him to explain a decision under oath, and did not enjoy what he felt afterward, a small, genuine disappointment settling somewhere under his ribs. He had met Elena only twice before, both times impressed by the clean, unhedged confidence of her numbers. He did not want to believe she had become the kind of engineer who shouted in a superior's office over a theory. But he also did not have her side of it in writing, and Marcus did. He called her in on Monday morning. The meeting was shorter than Elena expected, and colder. Richard did not raise his voice, which somehow made it worse. He sat with his hands folded on his desk, the posture of a man choosing his words with unusual care, and told her that he valued her technical work, that nobody at Halcyon doubted her competence, but that a report had reached him describing a confrontation in Marcus's office that concerned him. He used the word disappointed only once, quietly, almost as an aside, and it landed harder than anything Marcus had said to her directly. Elena sat very still through the whole conversation, spine straight, hands folded, giving nothing away in her face while something inside her chest slowly, silently caved. She did not defend herself with the same fire she'd shown Marcus. She simply repeated the numbers, evenly, the safety margin, the 6 flagged aircraft, the absence of any inspection order in the system, and watched Richard nod along without quite meeting her eyes. A man trying to hold 2 conflicting accounts in his hands at once, and finding the wrong one heavier because it had arrived first, on letterhead, from someone he had trusted longer. She left his office that morning feeling something she had not expected to feel through any of this. Not anger, but a bone-deep, exhausted doubt. Not doubt in her numbers. Doubt in whether numbers, however clean, could ever outweigh a well-timed story told by someone with a longer history in the building. That night, at her kitchen table, under the same lamp where she had reread her original memo a dozen times searching for a flaw that was never there, Elena opened a blank document and began, for the first time, to write something else entirely. A resignation letter. She wrote it in the plain, unadorned language she used for everything, no accusations, no explanation beyond the standard 2 lines about pursuing other opportunities. It took her 11 minutes. She sat back afterward and looked at it for a long time, her reflection faint in the dark window behind the laptop screen, and felt, underneath the exhaustion, something close to relief. Nobody could isolate her out of a job she had already left. Nobody could make her carry a risk that a whole building had decided not to see. Her cursor hovered over the button. Her hand, resting on the trackpad, did not move for a long moment, caught between 2 futures she could see with equal clarity, one where she walked away clean and slept again, and one where 6 aircraft kept flying on a fracture pattern only she still believed in. She did not send it. She closed the laptop instead, sat alone in the dark kitchen with her hands pressed flat against the cool wood of the table, and let herself, finally, cry, not loudly, not for long, the tired, silent kind of crying that comes from holding something too heavy for too many weeks. When it passed, she wiped her face with the back of her hand, breathed out slowly, and told herself she would decide in the morning. She did not know yet that the decision would be taken out of her hands entirely, and far sooner than she expected. 6 weeks and 3 days after the memo went into its drawer, and less than 48 hours after Elena had sat alone in her kitchen with an unsent resignation letter still open on her screen, Halcyon Flight 2214 left SeaTac on a clear morning with 186 passengers and a crew that had done this exact climb 1,000 times before. Captain Ruth Alvarez felt it before the instruments confirmed it, a faint, wrong shudder through the airframe as the aircraft passed through 10,000 feet. Engine number 2. The vibration readings on her panel climbed past their normal band and kept climbing. She and her first officer worked the checklist with the calm, practiced hands of people trained for exactly this moment, and within minutes they had shut the engine down and turned the aircraft back towards SeaTac on one good engine and a great deal of discipline. The landing was uneventful, in the way that only a very well-trained crew can make an emergency look uneventful. No injuries. No panic in the cabin beyond the ordinary tightening of hands on armrests. To the passengers filing off the jet bridge that afternoon, it was a story they would tell at dinner, nothing more. Ruth Alvarez sat in the cockpit for a long moment after the last passenger had gone, hands still resting on her knees, staring at the dark, silent readout for Engine 2. She had flown for 18 years and trusted her training completely, the way Elena trusted her equations. But training was supposed to be the last line of defense, not the only one. Somewhere behind that dead engine was a decision that should never have reached her cockpit at all, and some part of her already knew it, long before the maintenance report confirmed it that evening. But when the maintenance crew opened the cowling that evening, they found a fragment of turbine blade sheared cleanly at the root, at the exact point Elena's model had marked in red 6 weeks earlier. Elena heard about it just past 10 that night, alone in the lab, still bent over the same fatigue calculations she had already run a dozen times. The radio in the corner, tuned low to local news out of habit, carried the story almost as an afterthought. A Halcyon flight had returned safely to SeaTac after a mechanical issue. Routine, the anchor said. Handled by the book. Elena did not move for a long moment. Her hand, holding a pencil over her notebook, went still in midair. She was not surprised that her prediction had been right. She had known it would be. What stopped her breath was the arithmetic of distance, how close 186 people had just come to becoming a number in someone else's report, and how that distance had been measured, in the end, by a memo sitting unread in a drawer. The next morning, Halcyon's communications office issued a 2-paragraph statement calling it a minor mechanical event handled according to standard procedure. Elena read it standing at the break room counter, coffee going cold in her hand. Her memo was not mentioned. Her name was not mentioned. 6 weeks and 3 days of silence had simply been folded into a sentence about routine maintenance, as though the warning had never existed at all. Something in her chest turned over, quiet and final, like a switch thrown in an empty room. She was done waiting for permission. That afternoon, she called the National Transportation Safety Board and asked for the investigator assigned to Flight 2214. Daniel Reyes met her 3 days later in a diner near the airport, not because it was procedure, he told her, but because he preferred to hear an engineer's story somewhere that wasn't built to make people nervous. He had a NTSB badge clipped to his belt and the unhurried patience of someone who had spent a career listening to people who were afraid to talk. He read her memo without interrupting, turning each page slowly, occasionally tapping a finger against a number as if testing it for weight. When he finished, he looked up at her for a long moment. "You wrote this before the incident," he said. It wasn't a question. 6 weeks and 3 days before. And they sat on it. They called it a monitoring item. Daniel exhaled, leaned back against the booth, and rubbed a hand over his jaw, the particular gesture of a man recalculating how bad a situation actually was. "You understand what you're handing me?" "I understand what I'm risking," Elena said. Her voice did not shake, though her hands, wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't touched, were not entirely steady. "I've already lost the room at Halcyon. I'd rather lose it having told the truth." Something shifted in Daniel's face then, respect settling into the lines around his eyes. "For what it's worth, Dr. Voss, I've read a lot of internal memos in this job. Most of them are written to protect somebody. Yours reads like it was written to protect an airplane." It was a small thing, one sentence in a diner booth, but Elena felt it land somewhere she hadn't expected, a place that had gone cold and unvisited since the day Marcus closed his office door on her. For the first time in weeks, someone had read her numbers and heard exactly what she meant by them. Grace called that same evening. Word had reached her, the way word always did in a building that size. Elena braced for caution, for another careful warning about timing. Instead, Grace's voice came through steady and low. "I should have gone to the board with you the first time," Grace said. "I didn't, because I was protecting my own seat at the table. I'm done doing that." A pause, the sound of someone squaring her shoulders on the other end of the line. "Whatever room you're walking into next, I'm walking in beside you." The board meeting was called for the following week, and Elena stood at the head of a long table with the sun coming in low through the west windows, laying a hard yellow light across a room full of men who had not expected to be questioned. She did not raise her voice. She had learned, long before this week, that the loudest person in the room was rarely the one who was believed. Instead, she laid the record down piece by piece, plainly, the way she built everything, the original memo, dated and time-stamped. The fatigue calculations. The revised safety margin, well below the threshold Halcyon's own engineering standards required for continued airworthiness. The preliminary NTSB findings on Flight 2214, confirming the fracture point matched her model to the millimeter. Marcus sat near the far end of the table, arms crossed, jaw working slightly, a man watching a door he had spent weeks holding shut finally come off its hinges. One of the outside directors, an older man with a gray mustache and the flat, incredulous look of someone hearing bad news for the first time, interrupted her partway through. "You're telling us this was flagged 6 weeks before the incident?" "In writing." 6 weeks and 3 days, Elena said. "I can give you the exact hour if it matters." And it went nowhere. It went into a drawer marked under review. That's not nowhere. That's somewhere very specific. She let the sentence sit in the room a moment before continuing, watching the director's mustache twitch as he glanced, once, toward Marcus. "An airframe can be patched," Elena said, closing her folder. "A wing can be reskined, an engine can be replaced, a blade can be swapped for a better one. But there is no retrofit for a decision made in bad faith." Once that fails at altitude, there's no recovering it. That failure doesn't stay in a hangar. It comes home with 200 people in the cabin. The silence that followed had weight to it, the particular density of a room recalculating its own risk in real time. Richard Hale, chairman and CEO, had said almost nothing through the entire presentation. He now leaned forward, elbows on the table, and looked past Marcus toward Elena with the flat, assessing gaze of a man doing very fast, very unpleasant math, legal exposure, an open federal investigation. A memo with a date on it proving the company had known and chosen silence. He thought, briefly and privately, of the memo Marcus had sent him weeks earlier, the careful language about compromised judgment and alarmism, and of his own quiet disappointment sitting across from a woman who had, it turned out, been the only person in the building telling him the truth. He did not keep that thought private for long. Richard set both hands flat on the table and stood, the scrape of his chair loud in the silent room. He looked down its length, past the outside directors, past Marcus, until his eyes found Elena's. Dr. Voss, I owe you an apology, and I'd rather give it here, in front of this table, than in private where it would be easier for me and mean less to you. His voice was steady, but there was something raw underneath it, a man laying down weight he had been carrying since he first read Marcus's memo. Weeks ago, I sat you down in my office and told you I was disappointed. I used that word to your face, based on an account I never once thought to question, because it came from someone I'd trusted for 12 years and you'd been in the building for 2. That was a failure of judgment on my part, not yours. I'm sorry. The room had gone very still. Elena felt the apology land somewhere she had not expected, a tightness in her throat she had to swallow down before she trusted herself to nod. Richard turned then, and his gaze, when it settled on Marcus, had lost every trace of the careful diplomacy boardrooms usually ran on. And you? His voice did not rise, but it hardened, each word set down like a fact that would not be argued with. You had a memo on your desk with a date on it, 6 weeks and 3 days before that aircraft came back to SeaTac on one engine. Instead of acting on it, you spent your energy managing the engineer who wrote it, and when that stopped working, you wrote me 3 pages designed to make her the problem. You didn't just fail this company's safety standards, Marcus. You used my trust in you as a weapon against the one person in this building who was right. He let the silence stretch, the outside directors very carefully studying their own folders. We'll discuss your position separately. Not today and not in front of this table. But make no mistake, there will be a conversation. Marcus's jaw worked once, twice, and then he said nothing at all, which was, for a man who had never once run out of a smooth answer, its own kind of confession. Ground the fleet, Richard said, turning back to the room, his voice settling into something businesslike again, though he held Elena's eyes a moment longer first. All units matching the flagged fatigue profile, effective immediately. I want an inspection protocol on my desk by Friday. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to argue with. He did not look at Elena again for the rest of the meeting. Elena submitted her resignation letter 3 days later, the same 11-minute document she had written and not sent that night at her kitchen table, unchanged except for the date at the top. She delivered it to Richard's office in person, the way she delivered everything that mattered, set on his desk with both hands. He read it slowly, and when he looked up, the flat, careful diplomacy of the boardroom was gone from his face entirely, replaced by something closer to genuine alarm. Elena, don't do this over Marcus. He's already being removed from fleet operations. I gave him that conversation myself, the one I promised the table I would have. This isn't about Marcus. Elena stood with her hands loosely at her sides, no longer folded, no longer bracing for anything. There was a calm in her posture Richard hadn't seen in any of their previous meetings, the settled stillness of a decision already made rather than one still being defended. It's about the fact that 6 aircraft flew for 6 weeks and 3 days on a fracture pattern I flagged in writing, and the system built to catch that kind of warning let it fall through anyway, all the way up to your desk. You apologized to me in that room, and I believed you meant it. But an apology doesn't rebuild the process that let it happen in the first place. I can't keep doing this work in a building where the truth needs an accident behind it before anyone will act on it. Richard was quiet for a long moment, turning a pen slowly between his fingers, the gesture of a man searching for the argument that would actually hold. Then let me change what you'd be walking back into. Not Marcus's old seat. A new one, reporting directly to me, full authority to ground aircraft on your signature alone. No review board standing between your findings and the tarmac. Whatever number you were making before, I'll double it. I don't want to lose the one engineer in this company who was right when it mattered. For a moment, Elena let herself imagine it, the office, the authority, the number attached to it, and felt nothing pull her toward any of it. I believe you'd build that role exactly as you're describing it, she said, and meant it, which somehow made the refusal easier to say plainly. But you're offering me a better version of the same building, Richard. I don't want a bigger seat at this table. I want to work somewhere that doesn't need me to nearly lose an airplane before it remembers how to listen. She told him, then, about the call she had received 2 days earlier from a division director at the National Transportation Safety Board who had read the Flight 2214 file from the inside, memo and timestamp and all, and wanted to know if Dr. Voss would consider joining their engineering staff permanently, not as an outside expert brought in after the fact, but as one of their own, with a mandate to dig into exactly the kind of fatigue anomaly that had cost her a career at Halcyon to prove. It was not a bigger office. It was a different one, built by people who had read her memo and seen a warning instead of a liability. Richard set the pen down and, after a moment, nodded, the particular nod of a man conceding an argument he privately agreed he had already lost. Then I hope they know what they're getting, he said. For what it's worth, Elena, I am sorry. Genuinely. And I mean that regardless of which building you walk into next. I know, Elena said. That's why I came to tell you myself instead of leaving it in an email. She left his office for the last time without looking back and did not feel the small, private ache she had braced for. Only the light, uncomplicated relief of a decision that had, in the end, not been difficult to make at all. Months later, on an ordinary Thursday evening, she found herself at a small diner near Reagan National, a long way from SeaTac, across the booth from Daniel Reyes, a habit that had somehow followed her across the country and become a standing appointment neither of them had quite agreed to out loud. They were colleagues now, technically, on paper, 2 floors apart in the same NTSB building, though neither of them had gotten around to mentioning that particular detail to human resources yet. You know, Daniel said, turning his coffee cup slowly by the handle, in my line of work, I've met a lot of people who say they trust the data more than they trust people. It's usually true, Elena said. Usually. He looked up, and there was something warm and a little unguarded in it, the kind of look that did not belong in an incident report. I'm starting to think I might be the exception to your rule, Dr. Voss. Elena felt the corner of her mouth lift before she could stop it, an unfamiliar, easy warmth spreading through her chest, nothing at all like the cold, focused stillness she'd felt the morning she found the crack. She turned her own cup slowly, mirroring him, and did not look away. Don't get used to it, she said. I still run the numbers on everything. Good, Daniel said. Run them on this, too. Outside the window, a jet lifted off into the evening light, climbing clean and steady, exactly the way it was supposed to. Elena watched it go, and for the first time in a long while, she did not need to check the math to know it would hold.